Now we're going to talk a little bit about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. In this next part of the module, we're going to go through defining ADHD, what are the clinical criteria of ADHD, how do you treat ADHD, and also dive into a lot of the neuroscience. How is the brain of someone with ADHD different from the neurotypical brain? And the cool thing is, as we dive into all of these details, we'll start to develop a roadmap of how you can get control of your ADHD. The first thing to understand about ADHD is that it is bizarrely the most overdiagnosed and the most underdiagnosed condition that I've seen as a psychiatrist. So what I mean by that is that a lot of times when adults come into my office and they complain of problems like, I'm depressed, I'm struggling at work, I'm struggling in my relationship, and they sort of think they have depression, what they've actually got is ADHD. The reason they're struggling at their job, the reason that they're having difficulty in their relationships is because their ability to pay attention is actually severely impaired. On the flip side, it's also overdiagnosed, where a lot of times I'll see parents come in with their kids and say, my kid has ADHD, like, please do something about it. Oh, his ADHD is so bad. Or even I'll have adults come into my office and say, I think I've got ADHD because I can't focus on things, I can't pay attention. I really should study, but I'm struggling to study. I can't really do my work. And they don't actually have ADHD. The problem is that they're not sleeping, drinking too many energy drinks, and spending too much time on the internet. That does not equal a diagnosis of ADHD. So the bizarre thing is that it tends to be overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. So let's dive into a little bit about how common actually is ADHD. So the first thing to understand is that most of our research on ADHD actually comes from kids. So what we know is that about 5% of kids are diagnosed with ADHD, and about 2.5% of adults are diagnosed with ADHD. So that number may seem really, really small, right? Because increasingly what's going on is that a lot of people feel like they have ADHD or that their ADHD is getting worse. And let's try to understand that for a second. So how is it that society as a whole feels like their attention is getting more and more disordered? And I think this has to do with a lot of global trends that are happening within our society today. The first and foremost is technology usage. So the way that technology has penetrated into our lives is growing with each passing day, week, or even hour. If you think about your phone, over the course of 1 week, how many apps need updates? And when you update an app, what does that app actually do, right? How is technology changing from week to week? Chances are that you're going to get more notifications. Chances are that the interface of the app is going to become brighter and more colorful. And now it's going to ping you about this. And there used to be apps that didn't give notifications, but now every app gives notifications. We're also seeing some other really interesting global trends on attention. So if you think a little bit about, the way the internet used to be, it used to be blog posts, right? The most famous content creators on the internet would make blog posts. And a blog would be, 600 words about a particular topic, or even 1,000 words or 2,000 words. But now with each passing year that's gone on, blog posts have shrunk, they've become Facebook status updates, and then they got restricted to 160 characters on Twitter. And it's kind of funny because now we have twitlongers that are, back to blog posts. But in general, what we're seeing is that our attention span is actually decreasing. We also see this with video content as well, whereas back in the day, people used to make video essays, and they still do today, but now we're seeing shorter and shorter content. We also see this in content directed towards kids. So when I was growing up, there would be like a 30-minute TV show that I would watch. But now we have 5-minute clips, 4-minute clips, shorts, TikToks, 60 seconds of something, 30 seconds of something. And so what we're actually seeing is that, the most successful YouTube videos at children actually are compilations of very, very short clips that the kid just watches one video that's a 60-second clip, 60-second clip, 60-second clip. So we're starting to see a global change in how our attention span is being affected. Our attention span doesn't need to be long anymore. And anytime we see successful content, we get bored of who has time to read a 2,000-word blog post? Like, give it to me in a 5-minute video that has, diagrams and cartoons and like other kinds of visuals and things like that, right? Give me a 160 character tweet instead of like a nuanced scientific paper about COVID, right? Because where is most of the information exchange happening on COVID? How many people are reading scientific papers on COVID? Very few. But how many headlines do you see? Tons, right? How many tweets do you see? Tons. So what we're starting to see is a global change in our attention span. And as we're getting bombarded more by shorter and shorter kind of clips of stuff, our minds are sort of losing the ability to stay focused on one thing for a long period of time, right? We all want summaries, and if you guys even know what this is, cliff notes about everything, right? We want TLDRs, that's the modern version of it, right? And because this is what's started to happen is like we don't even read the whole thing. So even people who post will be like, here's the TLDR, here's the 1-sentence version if your attention span can't handle the 6-sentence version. So there are also some other global trends which are kind of interesting and maybe sort of scientifically not really that well validated, but there are even correlations with, for example, omega-3 to omega-6 ratios in our diet and the rise of ADHD. There are some studies that suggest that processed foods and even color additives can make ADHD worse. There are even some studies that show that the carbohydrate to protein ratio in your diet may be affecting your level of ADHD. So we're not entirely sure. We don't have great scientific evidence to know why everyone feels like their ADHD is getting worse. But what we do know is that the rate of diagnosis seems to be increasing. And furthermore, that people feel like they're struggling with their attention more, which is also paradoxically, I think, why we see such an interest in mindfulness. So mindfulness has exploded. And why is that? Why are people so much more interested in meditation today than they were 30 years ago? And I think that's because people are sort of learning that something about my mind is changing. Something about my ability to focus is changing. Something about my ability to stay motivated and stay on task. It feels like it's getting harder. And so as a result, people have sort of figured out, okay, like now I actually need a tool. I need a technique. I need some way to counteract what's changing in my mind. Things feel harder to do than they used to be, and thus we're seeing a rise in mindfulness. So this is why I think that ADHD is becoming more and more important, and why we chose to include it in this guide. In the guide, we're going to talk about a lot of non-clinical interventions. So how to organize, how to prioritize, how to deal with procrastination, how to manage your emotions better, how to find motivation, how to meditate, obviously. But this section of the guide is going to be focused on a clinical understanding, because a lot of people out there don't really realize what is really ADHD. How do I know if I'm not sleeping well, or if I need some kind of, do I just need to meditate, or do I actually need to go see a psychiatrist? Do I need to see a therapist? So now we're going to dive a little bit in general about what ADHD is. So the biggest thing that I sort of think of, if there's one central concept that governs ADHD, it is disordered attention. So a lot of people think that disordered attention means just being unable to focus or keep your attention on one thing. But the interesting thing is that clinical studies about ADHD show that it's not just the inability to keep your focus on one thing, it's also paradoxically hyperfocus. So people who have ADHD will lose hours and hours and hours in one activity, and they're unable to let go of a particular activity and focus on what they need to. So it's kind of paradoxically hyperfocus when you don't want to, as well as being unable to focus when you want to. So it's really disordered attention. The next core feature of ADHD is impulsivity. So I don't know if y'all have ever seen a kid that just like can't sit still, right? Like they come to your house, they're supposed to be there in dinner, their parents are going insane, and the kid is wiggling around and they're like moving this, they're dropping their forks, they're making a mess, right? So what we see in impulsivity is that in children, it manifests as hyperactivity. And the problem is, since all of the original diagnostic research on ADHD was done in children, we sort of didn't really appreciate until recently that impulsivity looks different in adults. So all these clinicians were looking for hyperactivity. But when you become an adult, your ability to like sit in a chair gets better, right? You're able to like sit still, and even if your mind isn't paying attention, you can force yourself to sit there and like lose track of the conversation completely. So that impulsivity manifests differently in adults. So a good example of this is sometimes people will come into my office and say, I'm bipolar. And I'll ask them, like, what do you mean by that? well, I can't control my actions. You know, 1 minute I'll be doing this, and then I'll get really upset about something, or I'll get really excited about something, and then I'll go and like do this thing, and then I get really upset. So then I lose my excitement, and then I start this. So they'll kind of describe themselves as bipolar, and they'll sort of see that their mood swings wildly, and that their behaviors are also quite impulsive. And they think that that's bipolar because 1 minute there's this way, and 1 minute that's this other way. But that's not actually bipolar disorder. What that is adult ADHD, right? That's adult ADD, actually. So what we're starting to see is that this impulsivity in adults looks different. So adults who struggle with ADHD have a lot of problems that make them just feel like incompetent adults. So they're forgetful, they're messy, they can't organize things, they don't know how to prioritize. And the other problem that they tend to get very overwhelmed with is another change we're seeing in society is that we have so many more choices than before. When I was growing up, in terms of like which TV shows I watched, there weren't that many choices, right? This was like back in the days of like, you know, cable television where your only choice is what's on the channel at that time. If you wanted to watch a cartoon, you had to wake up at 6:30 because it wasn't a very popular cartoon. As we get bombarded with choice, people with ADHD are more vulnerable to distraction, especially adults, and they become more paralyzed with their ability to act. So we're starting to see that these core features of attention and impulsivity are really what constitutes ADHD. These look a little bit different in children and look a little bit different in adults. And part of the reason that it's so hard to understand if you are an adult with ADHD, and it can be revolutionary in terms of the diagnosis and the realization that you are an adult with ADHD. The reason it's so hard is because a lot of these diagnostic criteria were formed based on children. So now what we're going to do is dive in a little bit further. We're going to understand really how do you make a diagnosis of ADHD? What are the treatments of ADHD? Because what everyone sort of jumps to is stimulant medication, things like methylphenidate or amphetamine salts, which is Adderall. And so everyone's like, oh my God, this is the other kind of funny thing, is that when it comes to ADHD medication, I also see that dichotomy where like some people really, really want the medication. They're like, oh my God, I need Adderall. I need amphetamines. I need my mind to focus. I want to take a pill that will help my mind focus. And on the flip side, other people are like paranoid about it. No, I don't want a stimulant. I don't want a stimulant. Like, no, oh my God, I don't want any treatment for ADHD. And when they say I don't want any treatment, they're not talking about how to organize your life. What they're talking about is I want to stay away from, drugs of abuse that people will get high on, right? And then the other side of the people, sometimes you'll have addicts who come in with ADHD claiming they have ADHD as well. So that's another source of overdiagnosis. So we're going to dive a lot into, how do you diagnose it? How do you treat it? What are some of the methods of complementary and alternative medicine that we think about? And also really take a neuroscientific approach to ADHD. Towards the end, we'll also look at some of the comorbidities. So what's the relationship between ADHD and depression? What's the relationship between ADHD and parenting? And other things like how does ADHD interact with addictions or anxiety? And hopefully by giving you this overview, which isn't a substitute for actual clinical treatment, but by giving you this overview, we hope to empower you as a human being to understand ADHD, understand what it looks like, how it can manifest, so that you may know actually better, okay, should I see a psychiatrist about this? Should I get a diagnosis? Should I get evaluated? Should I engage in treatment? Because a lot of what I found is that there are a lot of stigmas around the diagnosis. And by empowering patients, by empowering people to understand mental health the way that we do with physical health, we'll take a significant step forward in starting to treat it and overcome it.